thank you for being with us today. This interview is part of the series Changemakers Around the World for FOGS, the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. Today's invitee is a social entrepreneur, general coordinator, and founder of Rizomatica. Peter, could you please describe what does social entrepreneurship mean to you?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Arturo. Sure, so social entrepreneurship is a concept that I learned not so long ago. It's something I didn't necessarily realize I was doing until people told me that's what I was doing. I think it's about trying to find solutions to everyday problems that are creative and holistic, I would say. So kind of how do you apply the entrepreneurial spirit to social change? And that same kind of energy and passion and creativity to solving different social problems, I would say. So I think for me personally, the part of my work that most excites me is the fact that I get to solve problems on a daily basis. I think that's a really big part of it, that it's not just doing the same thing over and over, but that you're constantly reflecting on what you're doing and finding new and better ways to do it. And also learning from your mistakes.
And now could you please explain what is Rizomatica to us?
Sure. So Rizomatica is an organization that I started around 10 years ago. And we work around the world. We basically have a few different things that we do, but everything is centered around the idea of self-determination and communication. So we try to find technological solutions, regulatory solutions, and organizing and sustainability solutions for communities and people that want to be connected, that want to communicate. So we work with mainly we work with indigenous communities in Latin America. That's kind of the strongest aspect of our work. So we have a big project in Mexico with indigenous communities in the state of Oaxaca who have built, with our help, their own cell phone network, their own federated cell phone network that the communities own and operate. We're also working with communities in the Amazon, in Brazil, in Ecuador, to use other technologies, shortwave radio, and a system that we developed called Hermes to help send digital information over shortwave radio and also be able to encrypt and protect that information. We also work with, groups around the world, I would say, on some larger projects that try to make a more enabling environment for what we call community networks, which are just basically community-led and owned initiatives for connectivity, whether that's for telephony or internet or radio or whatever that is. So yeah, that's kind of the overview of what we do. Okay.
And does the word Rizomatica actually really exist? And if yes, what language does it come from and what does it mean? And if no, why this name?
It doesn't exist. It's based on the word rhizome. So a rhizome is basically a decentralized root structure. It's taken from the world of biology and plants. And the idea there, what we were inspired by, or I guess me, I was the one who named the organization, but the inspiration that I had was basically this idea of kind of the serendipitous nature of communication and things being able to connect to each other in different ways, and there not being a centralized sort of trunk or structure. So this idea of decentralization, this idea that different nodes could pop up in different places at different times and they could all kind of interconnect with each other organically. That's where it came from. And then I just added the Rizomatica part at the end to make it sound more, I don't know, technological, I guess.
Makes sense. So at FOGS, we try to promote the idea of globalization that is more ethical, fair, inclusive, and sustainable. Concretely, what is wrong with the current globalization regarding the communities touched by Rizomatica?
Sure. So I think there's kind of the general answer to that. That's not really about communications or telecommunications, which is around, different models of extractivism, of neoliberalism that put many indigenous communities and many rural communities in very tough situations economically, in terms of natural resources and so on. So this kind of idea of territorial defense is a big piece of the work that we do, how communities can stay in their communities and live healthy and prosperous lives in the ways that they want to live, rather than kind of something that's imposed or something that's coming in and extracting everything from them. In terms of telecommunications and how communications kind of fit into that, there's also, I would say, kind of like a hegemonic way of doing communications around the world, and that we're all familiar with, I would say. In any country you go, there's mobile operators, there's broadband providers and so on. And those companies have kind of been given free rein somehow, in the sense that they're allowed to work wherever they want and whenever they can make money, and are not, in most cases, required to work anywhere else. So the problem is with this kind of idea is that if you have these companies who have kind of been given the keys, have been given the permission to be in charge of the communication for all of society, and the problem there is that they're only working where they can make money. Mm-hmm. And so that's why about half of the world's population isn't able to get online. So I think we agree in the sense of we have to reimagine some of how we do things, that we can't just assume that letting the market, quote unquote, decide, or letting private companies be the only ones. So our kind of position on this is not so much to say, oh, it shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be large telecommunications companies. It's more that they're working in the places that it makes sense for them to work, and they're leaving a ton of space uncovered, unconnected. And that's an opportunity to do things differently. And that sort of opportunity, I think, should be taken and should be really thought about how we can do things differently, do things better, and do things more equitably.
Yeah, I think we totally agree on the fact that we need to rethink the concept of globalization. Mm-hmm. And Peter, what is your background? Did you have any specialization in telecommunication technologies before starting Rizomatica, or maybe in telecommunication infrastructure, or did you learn on the job?
Yeah, so my background is completely kind of in social sciences. I have a bachelor's degree in urban studies and a master's degree in rural development. So my job has always been more on the kind of social and human side of the work that we do. Mm-hmm. At this point, I've learned quite a bit about how all this stuff works, but I'm not a telecommunications engineer, and all of the kind of, hardcore engineering and programming part is done by the folks that I work with, who are all very talented. And thankfully they're around, because I definitely have no idea how to do any of that. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I would say I kind of came up with the idea and then tried to find people who had similar ideas and had different sets of technical skills. And we've all been working together on this for a while.
Okay. And so Rizomatica mainly focuses, as you said, on rural indigenous and so sometimes isolated communities. Do you have some kind of a personal link to these isolated communities that may have motivated you to work to support them?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started having, I ended up, my kind of first social entrepreneurial thing that I ever did was help start an organization in my hometown of Philadelphia in the United States, working with undocumented migrants coming from Mexico and Central America, all of whom were basically leaving rural areas and moving to the city up north to be able to kind of make money and survive. And so through that experience, I ended up going and visiting a lot of the communities where these people were coming from, and just learning about, I would say kind of for me, the connection is always between, the kind of the urban and the rural. It's sort of how does the rural world function as in many ways, as kind of a satellite of the urban world, and how can we kind of rethink that? And then from there, I ended up having just kind of increasing amounts of experiences in these kinds of communities over the years, and just listening to people talk about their challenges. That seemed, I don't want to say solvable, but certainly things that, if more effort, kind of like talking to these campesinos coming from Mexico, or talking to people in Nigeria I worked with, they're just kind of left, to their own their own devices somehow, and then there's all of these policies made, and kind of the same idea of globalization affects them in these very, very direct ways, and they have almost no way to participate in that or to push back against it. So yeah, that just became very kind of interesting to me, and I just continually found myself in these communities, in these places, drawn somehow to that, and yeah, then I went back to school and got a master's degree in rural development, as I said. So yeah, I don't have I guess I'm not a personal, personal history connection, but just over since my kind of early 20s have been working in these places.
Okay, and let's consider that expression and communication are fundamental rights, but how does Rizomatica concretely help these communities? Because, sometimes some people defend the idea that we should not impose technology on so-called indigenous or more traditional communities. So could you give us some concrete examples on how they benefit from improved telecommunications and how it can reinforce the values of a community as it's stated on your website? And also maybe are you aware of any negative side effects?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the first thing is that we don't impose anything. So communities kind of have to find us and ask us. And generally, that process, I would say that process for us is incredibly important. How are the communities making the decision by which they decide to enter into the technological world differently? So yeah, we have some pretty strict like internal guidelines and methodologies to ensure that we're actually working with communities that have collectively decided this is what they want to do. And then we kind of help them explore different options of how to do that. So that's an incredibly important piece, that we're not just kind of going around connecting whoever for kind of reasons that are our decision, but rather how does the community decide? And I think you're absolutely right. There's different kinds of technologies, and those different kinds of technologies have different impacts on people's lives. What I would say is that when most of these communities approach us, they have a notion that it can help them, but they also are concerned that it can also do harm. And I would say part of our job is to try to help them think through that. So you have communities who are like, look, we need to be in touch. We need to have communications. Someone gets sick, someone gets bitten by a snake, or the education of our children, now with the COVID pandemic happening, anywhere, people everywhere are thinking, how can I be in contact when I can't be physically moving around? So that's certainly there. And I think communities all around the world are completely aware of the usefulness of the technology. And then there's also these other issues. So I think the way that we work is based on the fact that we believe that we can get better outcomes when the communities understand and are able to engage in the design and the use of the technologies more fully. So that it's not just, oh yeah, we need to get connected to the internet, and then someone magically comes in and connects you to the internet, which is basically what happens to all of us in the city. We have very little to no agency in any of the communications infrastructure that we deal with. So it's sort of like you go to your provider and they're like, this is how much it costs, and you either pay them or you don't, So for me, again, this is kind of back to this idea of an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity, in addition to the need, there's an opportunity to do things differently. And certainly, and I think kind of the internet, unfortunately, has gone. Now, our focus is not only on the internet, but it's certainly a piece. And a lot of communities are like, yeah, we want to get on the internet. Like that's what we need. We need the internet. So we try to push back a little bit on that sometimes, say, well, what are you actually trying to do? Oh, well, we want to be able to send an alert when someone is coming in and illegally mining. It's like, well, do you actually need the internet to do that? Or is there another way to do it? And so, yeah, just my spiel here about the internet a bit is just that it is coming from a set of values and a set of principles that have gotten, I would say, somewhat far away from a kind of generalized benefit to society. So I think there was a lot of promise of the internet in the early days that I certainly got wrapped up in myself in terms of being excited about the potential of the internet. And I think we're now living in a time when it's an incredibly powerful tool, and it's being used for good, and it's also being used to do things that are not as positive. And I think the way that is lived and experienced in a lot of these communities is even more kind of potentially dangerous, culturally speaking. Just kind of, yeah, I mean, what is the effect that will have on the way of life in some of these communities? Now, obviously, access to information and so on will hopefully be a positive thing, but then there's all these other aspects that are maybe less savory that you have to somehow deal with, because it all comes together, unfortunately.
Yeah. And amongst the different areas of work of Rizomatica, there is the policy and regulatory advocacy. So how do you concretely create these spaces at the national and international levels for this small initiative to grow and
Right.
maybe have a big impact?
Yeah. So as I was saying earlier, and as we were kind of alluding to, you have basically big companies who are generally in charge of all of these communication services. And so the rules and regulations and policies generally favor those initiatives, which that's okay. It is what it is. The problem is it doesn't allow anybody else to participate. And that's kind of that's like our headline is, why should unconnected communities, or why should small initiatives, or why should non-profit manners of doing connectivity not have a seat at the table when we have so much that we can do, except for the fact that every rule and regulation and policy basically makes it impossible for us to do it. So that's kind of like our main headline. And so, yeah, we work at the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union, which is the body of the UN that is in charge of telecommunications, spectrum, the development of telecommunications, and so on. And then there's regional fora of that. The one we most engage with is called CTEL, which is part of the Organization of American States, and it's kind of like the ITU of the Americas. And then we work with national telecoms regulators as well. It's a long process. We've been very successful in some places. We've had longer, more difficult paths in others. But yeah, I mean, our work there, we have lawyers and policy people on our team who are really good at analyzing laws. And I think kind of our job there is that we try to take it outside of just the telecommunications regulations. So you say, look, the regulation says this, but the Constitution says everyone has a right to be connected, just to have an example. So you say, how do you actually harmonize those two things with each other? Because the regulations over here are actually not allowing for the most fundamental rights of the citizens of the country to be met. So how can we tweak or change these regulations so that it can do that? And there's a lot, I mean, it's very hard. That I say is in some ways the hardest part of our work, because you're dealing with, state bureaucracies, people who are just used to doing things a certain way, and are somewhat reticent to change and kind of let other people, kind of like weird people that they don't know, who are coming from very different background into their decision-making spaces. So yeah, it's very hard. It's a long-term project. I feel like we've been able to kind of get our own narrative, as it were, into all of these spaces, and it's just a question of pushing and pushing and pushing until people finally agree to bring you in.
Yeah. So do you feel that you keep moving forward, that things are going the way you would like? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a much more defined seat at the table now. That has its pros and its cons. It's like we're talking about being in these regulatory spaces where the other person there has a team of like 50 lawyers, and they can just go to every single meeting. They have unlimited resources somehow, whereas we don't. So it's definitely a kind of choose and pick your battles kind of thing, because just staying, I don't know, there'll be a 3-week meeting in Dubai, which is like, that's expensive, as a nonprofit. It's super, just having someone staying in Dubai for 3 weeks, going to this super long meeting, it's hard. It's not, we can't do that all the time. We don't have just like tons of people and tons of money to be able to do that. So yeah, we have to be very strategic and pick our battles somehow. But yeah, I think we're definitely making progress. I think part of that is also we see pushback in a lot of these fora now from some of the big companies, like, oh, who are these guys? What are they doing here? So that's good, the recognition, but also recognition that we need to do more.
Yeah, and could you describe the relationship that you may have with these big telecommunication companies that are supposed to own the monopoly of this sector? Is it conflictual or?
Yeah, I mean, it's like low-level conflict, I would say. I mean, we're not trying to take anything away from them, to be honest. We're not I mean, I guess that's maybe not totally true. Yeah, I mean, we do want things to be done differently, and they're obviously quite comfortable with the way things are since they more or less designed the whole system themselves. So yeah, there's pushback from them. I don't feel like it gets to a very, I mean, we're such a small entity somehow. They don't need to like spend too much time worrying about us. Sometimes they do when we get to like the exact place with the, like when we're right at the seat of power there, then we definitely see more negative pushback from them. But I think like most of this is mediated by governments, and governments also understand that things are not the way that they should be. I mean, in the sense that they've helped create the situation, but at the same time recognize that it could be better. So our general task, we don't really engage too much with the private companies because it's just, they have their thing, we have our thing. And so I think we engage much more with governments and try to help them, basically just try to help them meet their own goals. Like you go to a lot of the countries that we worked in, developing countries, the connectivity situation is not good. It's not good because there's, large rural populations, people are poor. So the companies that are like supposed to be in charge don't just work in the cities, and that's the end of it. So the governments are like, look, we also want all of our people to be able to access. I mean, even if it's just sort of selfishly government services or whatever it is, they understand that things are not that great. So anyone who comes with ideas, they're willing to listen. But it's a long process. Yeah.
And speaking of that, at Fox, we strive to work around the framework of a grand narrative. And this grand narrative of hope is based on three pillars: global governance, global citizenship, and global sustainability. And two of the 6 points of the Fox Hexalogue, which is supposed to represent this grand narrative, are active citizenship and responsive governance. So can we say that you played your role as an active citizen and started Rizomatica to fill a gap left by the public sector in some countries like Mexico, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, this idea of engaged citizenry around this topic, I would say we're not the only people doing it, but I think that we've been amongst the kind of first people to really try to get engaged on these topics that are highly technical and highly, like when we go to these ITU meetings, there's not a lot of civil society people at these meetings. It's just not something that citizens generally engage with. And it's completely understandable why. And I mean, from a personal level, I'm not even sure how I ended up there. It's just kind of like we needed to do it because it's part of the kind of package of stuff that has to get resolved if we want to do the work that we're doing. So yeah, I mean, I think this issue, I mean, and even if you look at kind of just generally from the just level of society, technology, it's creating a lot of transformations and a lot of challenges, and there isn't really sufficient civil society engagement, excuse me, in all of that. And some of those things there is, and there's lots of groups and organizations who do great work, but then there's other parts of the whole sort of ecosystem that no one is really engaging with. And that's what we tried to do, was to look at some of those areas and engage and kind of create the expertise internally to do that and have the resources to be able to do that. And yeah, I think, as I've been saying multiple times, it's a slow process to get, responsive governance, I think is the word you used, it doesn't happen overnight. It's very slow. So you have to be ready for a long process. And I think, I mean, generally what I would say is that we tried to set up our organization and kind of the projects that we do are all geared towards long-term engagement. So when we talk to communities, for example, we don't just say, hey, we're going to come and help you build this thing and then, see you later. It's, if we're going to do something together, we're going to be your partner for as long as you want to be our partner for. And I think similarly, in order to be successful and engage citizenry, it's ongoing. It doesn't end anytime, because the folks on the other side are continuing to fight for their interests as well. So you first have to get into the space to be able to fight for your interests, and then stay in the space. And that's, I think, where we're at with that.
Okay, yeah, I guess staying in the space is the hardest part. So we talked about the private sector, we talked about the public sector, the government, but you also mentioned the ITU. So you have connection with this agency of the United Nations. Could you describe this relationship, and do you have a relationship connection to other international organizations?
Yeah, so the ITU, like I said, is kind of the umbrella organization within the UN that deals with telecommunications things, issues, different aspects of it. So it's kind of like a supranational body, and the folks who can vote at ITU events or meetings are nations. So we can just observe. What we do sometimes is we partner with different countries. Like sometimes our people will be on the delegation of a certain country, so that we can actually have a real impact. And that's an interesting moment sometimes, because the national delegations are comprised of all kinds of different people. So you're like sitting on the same national delegation with someone from, I don't know, Telefonica. And you have to figure out, okay, what's the position of the country, not necessarily what are my personal interests. Anyway, I mean, I don't do that. I'm not the one who does that, but the folks on my team do. Yeah, we engage with ITU in the sense that we go to the meetings, we make our voice heard and vote every once in a while as part of a national delegation. We also do a lot of research and publications. So around the issue of, I don't know, expanding broadband or these things, ITU will ask us to write something for them that they can consider. So we'll do that. So yeah, I think it's kind of both. We engage in the space and also are kind of a trusted partner on some issues. And I would say that's kind of the biggest international space. There are other international spaces, also UN initiative is something called the Internet Governance Forum, which is this multi-stakeholder fora for doing the governance of the internet. So not just telecommunications, but the internet specifically. So we engage there as well in different ways. Yeah, and we also, I guess, we work somehow with national development agencies or overseas development agencies. So some of the projects we have are funded by, the Swedish International Development Agency, the British International Development Agency, who are, trying to, as part of their different international development portfolios, want to make connectivity a priority as well.
And I can only assume that this kind of project that you are pursuing must have known many success stories as well as some failures. So could you tell us about one of each, for example, that marked you in particular? Sure.
I mean, I think it's all sort of wrapped up together. Like I said, when you take the more long-term approach, it's kind of just a series of successes and failures that kind of just all stretch out into the horizon. I mean, I feel like our greatest success is that we're still going. We've been able to do some really important projects. Obviously, this project in Mexico with the cell phone networks, I think, was a big win in the sense that we've made it work technologically. We've gotten all of the permissions. Like every piece that needed to happen happened to actually make it work, and it's been going for some years. Now, inside of that process, there were, innumerable mistakes, failures, challenges, steps where you're like, this is never going to work. Where you're kind of like starting back from where you were a year ago because you made a miscalculation on, some strategy or something. So yeah, for me, the successes and the failures are frankly just all tied. They're all tied in with each other. And I think that anything that we're doing right now is because we learned either from a success or from a failure, and figured out how to sort of proceed from there. Which I think, tying it back into this idea of social entrepreneurship, is like a big piece of that. Is yeah, just kind of being aware that you're not going to get it right the first time, but also having the commitment to get it right eventually. I think is kind of the thing. And I mean, we're still learning a ton, and we're still changing, and every day communities are asking us to do new things and different things, and to figure out how to do it, you know, to stay relevant and to stay kind of meeting the needs of the community. So
yeah, considering failure as a diploma in a
totally.
sense. Yeah. Totally. Is Rizomatica your only initiative, or have you launched other projects, similar or not, since this one?
So personally, no, this has been my full-time thing since about 2011, 2012. Rizomatic has kind of given birth to some other things itself, but those are sort of independent, and maybe we kind of help somehow. But yeah, I mean, our way of working somehow is to try to facilitate, the work of others in some way. So not the vision for Rizomatic is not to like turn into some huge mega NGO. I mean, we're already like way bigger than I think I thought we would ever be, but really, like, when we work with people in different places, we really want to build their capacity and help them get where they want to go and strengthen others. So Rizomatic is a fairly small team, but then if you look at like the amount of people that we work with who are close partners, it's way larger than the actual staff of Rizomatic, and that's kind of been our way of doing it. So I think we're kind of pretty good at like cultivating a public image somehow, and then whatever support comes in through that, we're just able to pass on to partners and so on. So you know, this is kind of my gig for a while. My role personally has transitioned somewhat, so I don't like climb up the towers and install the equipment anymore as much. Sometimes I do, but less less than before. I'm personally doing more writing, so I think one of our jobs at Rizomatica is to contribute to new narratives around technology, around communications, and yeah, I've just been trying to carve out the space in my everyday work life to be able to do that and publish things and just try to get ideas out into the public around, you know, we can do this differently. Here are some of the issues, and just trying to take it from a perspective of like, you know, we work on this every day, we're facing all the challenges, and like, here's what we see, here's what we think about how things could be different and better.
And do you consider yourself primarily an entrepreneur, and I don't know, a philanthropist, an activist, or something else?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't usually apply that. I mean, I feel like I'm an entrepreneurial person, but I don't necessarily self-identify as an entrepreneur. I mean, I understand that, and I understand other people clearly say, oh yeah, this guy is a social entrepreneur, and that's fine. You know, I'm happy to accept that. Yeah, I feel more like there's a few different ways I think about myself in the work that I do. I mean, one is, yeah, certainly as an activist, someone who's trying to move certain issues forward for the purpose of social justice. And there is I think part of my job a lot of times is as a translator between worlds. And I think Rizomatic also tries to be kind of this layer of translation between, you know, the ITU and an indigenous community in the Amazon rainforest. Like, how do those people dialogue with each other around this issue? And that's, in some ways, it's very tricky somehow, because you have to be able to manage both narratives and both discourses equally well, and do so ethically. And so I think a lot of times that is kind of like the emissary of one world to another somehow, in both directions. So it's sort of like, how does a community engage with the ITU, and also how does the ITU engage with the community? And there needs to be this constant kind of translation, because there are two things that really, in many ways, are not shaped in any way to have this kind of dialogue with each other. So yeah, that's a lot of my thinking.
And what would be your main tips to people who would like to to become, let's say, social entrepreneurs, if that even exists.
Sure.
Who wants to have a social impact when they create their own company.
Right. I mean, I think there's a few kind of obvious ones, like you need to find a niche for yourself. You can't, I mean, like if there's already people working on what you want to do, it's probably best to first engage with them. And then from there, you can kind of develop a very particular, a niche. You're basically having the part that you're really good at. Like what are your core competencies, either as a person or as an organization, that are unique and that allow you to actually add something to the conversation, so that's it's actually useful. That I think is important. I think that the kind of perseverance is key. I mean, I've started, I think now 3 different sort of social organizations, and the beginning is always, you know, it's like you're doing it on faith. You're volunteering, you're out there passionately trying to learn and solve problems, and then maybe you'll be able to turn that into something more long-term, and maybe you won't, but you got to give it time and be patient and be perseverant, I think is the biggest part. Because I mean, again, certainly in this topic, we're like always climbing uphill towards something. Everything is a challenge, you know. Doing technology in rural areas is challenging. It's hard. Stuff breaks, you know, lightning hits it, the electricity goes out, all this. It's hard. It's not like, it's not something that you just kind of like, okay, I'll just, you know, follow the instructions and I'll do this and it'll just work. No, it's always constantly keeping it going. And I think the same in the policy spaces and any of the other, just working with communities as well. It's a labor of consistency, of commitment. So I think for me, perseverance, consistency, just like showing up and doing your thing that you're doing every day is the way to be successful as a social entrepreneur.
Well, Peter, our discussion is coming to an end. Do you have anything you would like to add?
No, I think we covered quite a bit. I appreciate the invitation, and looking forward to engaging with FOGS further in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will have some concluding words now. Thank you so much for accepting to talk with us and describe your project. It was a real pleasure to discuss with you, and I wish you all the best for what's coming next. And before closing this session, it is also my job to remind all of you to follow FOGS on social media: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Patreon. And do not hesitate to also follow Rizomatica on Twitter and LinkedIn. It was Arturo Bilia for the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. Bye-bye.